Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Roseville Wrecking Ball. The Roseville Wrecking Ball.
Joshua Shrum. He is a very talented steward, very knowledgeable.
The Roseville Wrecking Ball. This is one of those podcasts where I listen to every episode. I love what he's putting out there.
The Roseville Wrecking Ball. Josh Shrum.
Parcels of knowledge. Does a fantastic job with that podcast.
The Roseville Wrecking Ball. He is an Article 8 scholar, and thank God. We need Article 8 scholars right now.
Tune into the Parcels of Knowledge podcast while you're on the route. That's the mailman's playbook, brother.
Good morning, and welcome back to Parcels of Knowledge, that podcast dedicated to delivering knowledge to the city letter carrier with your host, the Roseville Wrecking Ball. Today we are on grievance number 137 for the year in the beautiful city of Roseville, Michigan. And I'm glad to be in my 8th week of route counting inspections. All right, so first I got to explain, I've had a short absence, and the reason being is I've had a stroke of bad luck lately. On Friday, the final day of my route counting inspection, which was the best day in according to the volume, I ended up getting heat exhaustion. And I know what you're going to say. Holy shit, how'd you get heat and exhaustion at 70 degrees? Unfortunately for me, I didn't realize I was sick. So I spent most of my day over 100 degrees. And the 70 degrees sun that was beating on the truck made it 90 inside my vehicle. And that didn't make my fever any better. I ended up trying to push through because it was the best day. I knew I was going to do maybe 10 hours, but I'm a little bit disappointed in myself because I couldn't go past maybe about 8 hours. I ended up sitting at the office for about 2 hours, and by the time I made it to the doctor's, I was still 101.8. So I'm not sure what my original temperature was, but holy shit, that was a crazy day. Didn't even know I was sick either because I didn't get most of the symptoms until the next day, other than the fever. But just goes to show you, I just been really sick and my throat's been sore. I haven't been able to make a podcast, and my equipment hasn't been with me. So, unfortunately, you've had some time without me. So today's going to kind of be a long one, and today's a good one too. It's Wrecking Crew Wednesday. That's right, Wrecking Crew Wednesday, and we have grown in numbers once again. Yes, now we're up to 20 members. 20 members of the Wrecking Crew. These badass individuals have been giving some money back, value for value. If you don't know what the Wrecking Crew is, it's my Patreon. And what they do is, if you feel like you have any value out of this podcast, you are welcome to join the Patreon and provide value back. And normally I use that to give back to the community. Not all of it's going back to the community. Of course, some of it's going to my equipment and costs, and some of it goes to me. So at the end of the day, it's being split in many different ways. But yeah, I'm glad to have you guys here. You guys are badass individuals, and I appreciate you making this podcast what it is. And if you're interested in joining, I'm going to have the link in the description. But without further ado, let's give these guys a salute. These guys are Rick Steiner, E.R., Tom Perry, Philip DeGilio, Chris Angeloff, Amy Tyvan, Ryan Ackers, Edmund DeVore, Miziel Guzman, Paul Siranowski, Jamie Gregory, Neil Beckman, Shannon Mossbarger, Kenneth Grigsby, Benjamin Shellhaas, Joni Weber, the Allentown Architect, Self Care, G Whiskey, and Daniel Pitts. All right. These individuals make this podcast what it is. I appreciate you guys a lot, and I appreciate every one of you listeners. Of course, the Wrecking Crew has chosen the topic for Wrecking Crew Wednesday, and that topic today will be using the ELM against management. It won out with a 50% vote, while the other topics had less than 50%. Now, before we get into the meat and potatoes, I do want to talk about, I'm going to have Rob Kosier on Saturday, if he doesn't cancel, for his run for Director of City Delivery. I was going to have Lloyd on last week, but Lloyd canceled, so I didn't have the ability to have him on. I know you guys sent in questions. Please send me some more questions for Director of City Delivery candidate, Rob Kosier, from Branch 2, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And he's going to answer any question you send in. Send him anything you're interested in asking for his candidacy for City Delivery Director, and even things that don't relate to it. If you think you can use it to measure him as a person, as a candidate, then send those questions in. Any question you want, we're having Rob Kosier on Saturday. Please send those questions in. I'm going to need them. That will also be in the description below. You send those questions to rosevillewreckingball at yahoo.com. At this point, I'll take them any which way. Send them to my phone number, 586-209-1902. In fact, feel free to call me anytime you guys need anything. So without further ado, let's go into the main topic today. Oh, you know what? One other thing. So last night was my branch meeting. And last month, they tabled my proposal for national convention resolutions on the fact that they were trying to get a committee together to clean up my language. I was on that committee. We did a little tweaking. It wasn't very much, but we came to a final resolve in terms of the language I'd like, and we voted on it last night. I'm from NALC 4374, South Macomb Letter Carriers. We have Pat Carroll, Jimmy K, and a few other people that are pretty well known. And fortunately for me, my convention proposals passed unanimously, not a single nay. And I'd like to read them here. But one's a legislative resolution and one's a contract resolution. And to be honest, most of the language is the same, other than the ending. It's about the undelivered mail, of course. It's about the undelivered mail. That's my favorite topic to talk about. But, we've had this problem where National won't recognize this as a grievance. So I'm going to read these, but for the parts that are the same, I'm not going to read them twice. So let's start with the National Agreement Resolution. Whereas 39 U.S. Code 101 maintains a public expectation that the service delivers 6 days per week and that they maintain a level of universal service that does not diminish in areas where it is not profitable to deliver to, that the cost of maintaining the service cannot be apportioned in such a way that would maintain different values of degrees of service in different areas, that in determining all policies for postal services, the Postal Service shall give the highest consideration to the requirement for the most expeditious collection of transportation and delivery of important letter mail. Whereas 39 U.S. Code 3691 expects the service to preserve regular and effective access to postal services in all communities, including those in rural areas or where post offices are not self-sustaining, and to reasonably assure Postal Service customers delivery reliability, speed, and frequency consistent with reasonable rates and best practices. Whereas, as letter carriers, each and every one of us took the following oath of office. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely, without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which I am about to enter, in accordance with 39 U.S. Code 1011. Whereas 18 U.S. Code 1703 and 18 U.S. Code 1701 maintains it is illegal to obstruct mail, and time after time again, the service has shown that their position is that violation of this is a fire rule offense for any city letter carrier. Whereas 18 U.S. Code 1693 states that whoever being concerned in carrying the mail collects, receives, or carries any letter or packet contrary to law shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 30 days or both. Whereas ELM 661.2, which applies to all postal employees, this includes management and upper management, claims that 39 U.S. Code 1011, 18 U.S. Code 1703, 18 U.S. Code 1693 are prohibited from being violated. Additionally, it adds in ELM 661.1 that failure for ELM 661.2 to mention a statute does not excuse any person from complying with the statute, incorporating 39 U.S. Code 101. The definition of any person includes from the Postmaster General all the way down to a first-day CCA. Whereas the Postal Service across the country is currently breaking course with their obligation to deliver all mail each day in an effort to serve patrons mail delivery 6 days a week to avoid penalty or proper staffing. Whereas with the passing of the Postal Service Reform Act of 2022, we had achieved in law the universal service of 6-day delivery, while also breaking management's requirement to pre-fund retirement, freeing more funds to be able to deliver the mail. Yet we have seen management intentionally deciding to do the opposite. Whereas historically we have been regarded as the most trusted government agency because of our exceptionally reliable delivery through rain, sleet, snow, and have been pillars of our community, the very faith that the city letter carrier has proudly built up is steadfast crumbling before our eyes. This has been our most valuable leverage at the bargaining table. This is being undermined by the service and their refusal to deliver to patrons. Whereas even the OIG has admitted that this behavior is not in accordance with the Postal Reform Act and with the National Color Code policy in their own reports, that first-class mail must be delivered on the same day as the receipt, in accordance with POM 621, also referred to page 3 of report number 21262R23, and page 6 of report number 24032-2R24. Whereas Article 3 of the National Agreement grants management the exclusive right to manage, subject to the provisions of the National Agreement and consistent with applicable laws and regulations. Resolved, that the NALC negotiate with the USPS to take the position that failure to deliver the first-class mail without utilizing all available resources such as ODL lists and auxiliary assistance to the maximum extent possible is a violation of the law, and as a result is a violation of Article 3 of the National Agreement. All right, so the legislative resolution reads exactly the same except for the final 2 paragraphs, which are replaced with a different resolve. And this one reads, resolved, that the NALC recognize that this is an issue and take a political position that this must be corrected and stopped. Resolved, that the NALC work with politicians to get an intent on whether or not 6-day mail delivery was intended to be for every house, or whether lawmakers intended for it to be as flexible as the service is using it today. Resolved, that the NALC use its political assets and organize a campaign to get this issue halted as soon as possible so as to not affect future bargaining leverage. All right, so that is the 2 resolutions. One is political, one is contractual. And all we're asking for is NALC to take a position so that we can finally start filing these grievances. Because once I take a position that it's a violation and the NBA's office is still stopping the grievance procedure, saying that it's not a violation, I'm going to start flinging some Article 10 charges around like it should be, because that's not their duty. Anyway, let's get to the main topic. We'll have plenty of time to talk about that. I'm going to post that on my Parcels of Knowledge Facebook, and maybe we'll get that on the website too, Philip. Let's get that up. But other than that, let's talk about using the ELM against management. Typically, the ELM is something that they use against us. And, you see it in discipline. 665 is the most common ELM citation in discipline. And also, technically, we can use the ELM ourselves. Now, we got to be careful with this one because we got to make sure that any provision we use in a grievance has to relate to wages, hours, and working conditions in accordance with Article 15.1. So, if you're trying to incorporate the ELM into any grievance, which I like to do, we're going to have to use Article 19. And the Article 19 reads in relevant part, those parts of all handbooks and manuals published, regulations of the Postal Service, and that directly relate to wages, hours, or working conditions as they apply to employees covered by this agreement shall contain nothing that conflicts with this agreement and shall be continued in effect except that the employer shall have the right to make changes that are not inconsistent with this agreement and that are fair, reasonable, and equitable. This includes, but is not limited to, Postal Service Manual and the F-21 Timekeeper's Instructions. So the caveat to this, if you're going to follow any of the advice that I'm giving today, which my advice is a gray area, so don't take it for fact. Certain stepbees and arbitrators might accept it, certain ones might not. But one thing you must do in every situation, and according to what I'm about to tell you, is prove that these things are related to wages, hours, and working conditions. And the best way we can prove that is by providing the harm to our wages, hours, or working conditions in our contentions. So, for example, if you think falsification of clock rings affects our wages, hours, and working conditions, you must provide proof as to how. For example, let's say falsification of clock rings led to someone losing time. Well, then you would just have to articulate that is applicable to our wages because we make less money because they stole time from us. That's as simple as it gets. So you just have to relate it to wages, hours, and working conditions, and you should be able to get through any argument that the ELM is not applicable to Article 19 or applicable to the grievance procedure. Other than that, I'm just going to dive right into it. We're going to start with ELM. We're just going to go through some examples. And there's more than what I'm going to say, but I'm going to give you some examples that I use myself. We're going to start with ELM 661. This is famously used in my undelivered mail grievances. 661 contains statutory provisions. By the way, before I move forward, a lot of what is built into the ELM imitates the law. So like ELM 661 is going to go through a lot of laws that we are forbidden to actually violate. Well, we know we're forbidden to violate it because it's the law. But what's cool is if you go through each one of these laws, a lot of these imitate. Our handbooks and manuals imitate the law. And the reason why is, at least I assume, is we used to be a government agency. So the law would directly apply anyway. But upon our split from the government, I think that the Postal Service tried to maintain the same rules and regulations. So they imitated a lot of the laws that became on the books when 39 U.S. Code was written, which was the U.S. Code that developed the Postal Service as it is today. My perfect example of this is if you look at 39 U.S. Code 1001, it's almost identical to Article 3 of the National Agreement. Item by item, it's almost the same. So that's exactly what I'm talking about. There's a lot of uniformity in the law and in a lot of our handbooks and manual expectations. So 661 goes over the fact that, 661.1 talks about how these laws are mentioned for information only, which is going to be an obstacle because it says nothing in this manual constitutes an interpretation or construction of these laws which might be construed as binding the United States Postal Service. But you can say that these laws do bind those officials who work for the United States Postal Service. So it is still applicable. Now, it talks about the ones that I would actually point out in ELM 661.2, which is a list of things. Protection against disloyalty. That's item C. Oftentimes, management charges you with loyalty. That comes from protection against disloyalty. It has to do with loyalty against the government. That's a very difficult one for management to actually prove. Protection against bribery, graft, and conflict of interest. I have actually used that law, conflict of interest, in terms of when management hires somebody or, promotes somebody which is in conflict with their relationship of a carrier that is their subordinate. For example, we had a 204B that was promoted to 204B that was currently in a relationship with another carrier. That is in violation of the conflict of interest laws, which, they state that there should be no conflict of interest in terms of the positions that you make, and especially as it comes to the money aspect. When it comes to they're going to be the ones distributing the overtime to the one that they're in the relationship with. Even if there is no violation in terms of like disparity of treatment, and it could go either way, they can treat them better or worse. Even if there's no violation of that, it's still the appearance of a violation could occur. So that's inappropriate in accordance with the law. I have actually used that one myself. If you want to use it yourself, you should check out 18 U.S. Code 208, 5 CFR 2635.501, 5 CFR 2635.502, and then there's also a letter from the Executive Vice President Donahoe that is relevant to that. If anybody needs it, just send me an email. See what I can do to get it for you. There's prohibition against fraud, which, by the way, I would use that. 18 U.S. Code 1001. Not 39 U.S. Code 1001, which I mentioned earlier. I get those two confused because of the same numbers, but this is what's good about 18 U.S. Code 1001. I'm going to read it. Except as otherwise provided in this section, whoever in any manner within the jurisdiction of the executive, which we are, legislative or judicial branch of the government of the United States, knowingly and willingly falsifies, conceals, or covers up by any trick, scheme, or device a material fact, makes any materially false, fictitious, or fraudulent statement or representation. Let's see, got to get to the next page. Makes or uses any false writing or document, knowing the same to contain any material false, fictitious, or fraudulent statement or entry, shall be fined under this title, imprisoned not more than 5 years if the offense involves international or domestic terrorism, imprisoned not more than 8 years or both. So this is actually really pertinent to the fact that management lately has been falsifying clock rings. Well, that's in direct violation of that U.S. code because we're under the jurisdiction of the executive branch. So that U.S. code is brought into the ELM under 661.2, which is brought into our national agreement under Article 19. So that is how you can do that with Article 19, use the ELM against management with 661. But ELM 661 is a small fraction of what I'm going for here. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit I'm sick, so it's going to be a little bit more rough today. I'm not going to edit this either because I don't have time. I have a lot of grievances to file today. But moving on. Like I said before, that situation with the conflict of interest. There is a procedure in the ELM that talks about how you handle those things. When I filed the grievance, I filed the procedure. In ELM 662, it talks about ethics advice. So typically, employees who have questions about the application of the ethics regulations should seek advice from an agency ethics official. That's what we did. So we sought to go talk to ethics. That's ELM 662.11. And in accordance with ethics, we found that as it relates to that particular time frame, there was no violation. I was not happy with that, but I did put in there that it doesn't preclude us from filing once new information surfaces. Well, guess what? New information surfaced later on, And we refiled the grievance, and we said that, yes, management violated that particular provision. So we're going to move on to ELM 665, which is going to be the most beneficial section you're going to use the ELM against management. So oftentimes management charges us with many of the things that are applicable in ELM 665. We can charge them with the same things, and if they don't result in discipline, we can use that to our advantage. That's what I've done many times, because ELM 665 is Postal Service Standards of Conduct. This applies to employees. That includes all employees. So these codes of conduct actually apply to management as well. So if management's sitting there filing ELM 66513, 66515, and 16 against us, and I file grievances against them for the same issues, and they settle those grievances, I'm going to ask later on when my employee gets charged with those things, I'm going to ask for what discipline was management issued when they were charged with those things and they agreed to the violation. If that's no discipline, well then that's not equitable distribution. And those employees are similarly situated like equitability for just cause actually requires. Because both employees, even though they're different positions, they are both covered under ELM 665. So generally, they use loyalty against us. I wouldn't suggest you putting that in your grievance, but if you put it in and they agree, that's fine. But 66513 would be a good start. Discharge of duties. Employees are expected to discharge their assigned duties conscientiously and effectively. Well, in times where management has failed to input 1260s, where management has failed to go over observations with carriers in the time frame that it expects, where management has falsified documents, I have charged them with discharge of duties, and they've agreed to it. Of course, like I said, you got to relate it to how it relates to wages, hours, and working conditions. So those three specifications, it does relate to the issues that we face on a day-to-day basis. 66515, obedience to orders. I have filed this one before, although I think it's debatable whether or not this is actually a thing, but I filed this one in terms of a Formal A settlement. So, for example, it says employees must obey the instructions of their supervisors. If an employee has reason to question the propriety of the supervisor's order, the individual must nevertheless carry out the order and may immediately file a protest in writing to the official in charge of the installation or may appeal through official channels. So, I know it says supervisors. That's an obstacle. But one way I've used this before is if I file a grievance and at Formal A, me and the postmaster have settled an instructional resolution. That means we settled a resolution that expects action in the future, like a payment or maybe cease and desist on a particular violation. And then the supervisor violated that anyway in the future. I consider that an order from their superior because the postmaster signed that agreement. I'm not the superior, of course, I'm not. But although I should be, but I'm not. But the postmaster is, and they were a signatory of that grievance. And they said that the Postal Service will no longer violate the agreement in this fashion. And then they did it anyway. So if it was the supervisor who decided to do it, I try and file obedience to order along with whatever else, Article 15 noncompliance. I just tack it on. And if they agree to it, that's great. 66516, behavior and personal habits. This one I have used exclusively with mutual respect and JSOB. Falsification as well. Employees are expected to conduct themselves during and outside the working hours in a manner that reflects favorably upon the Postal Service. Although it is not the policy of the Postal Service to interfere with the private lives of employees, it does require that postal employees be honest, reliable, trustworthy, courteous, and of good nature and reputation. So it also prohibits employees from engaging in criminal, dishonest, notoriously disgraceful, immoral, or other criminal or other conduct prejudicial to the Postal Service. So this one also talks about, essentially violating the law as well. But ELM 66516, I have historically used this as a basis for things like falsification, mutual respect, things of that nature. And like I said before, when you file these things and they settle that they violated it, later on down the line, when your carriers violate that, ask for management's discipline. And you can guarantee they're not going to have any. Then, you can say, well, management sets the standard. They're the driving force behind an example of who we should be. So if they're not getting disciplined, it's a behavior tolerated, because the behavior tolerated is an acceptable behavior, and in any reasonable observer. So if you see management's behavior being tolerated and you're being charged with the same thing, that's not equitably enforced. In fact, I'd say that it's hard to understand the rule if they're going to do that as well. Also, 665.24, this is self-explanatory. Violent or threatening behavior. I've only used this where management threatened discipline. And even, a blanket threat. Like, oh, I'll give you something to file. They've done things like that, and I've filed for threatening behavior. Those are very particular things that fit into particular situations. Now, requirement attendance requirements, I'm not saying we should file any of those grievances, but pay attention, because ELM 665.4 applies to all employees. A lot of times it says any employee, or employees. That means it applies across the board. And if management's not following the same standards of attendance as you, it's a good way to try and use that against them. I wouldn't say charge them with anything, because we don't want to use the ELM in a way that's disciplinary. That's not our job. A lot of times they'll relate grievances to disciplinary action. Absolutely not the same thing. For management, they can violate 1,000 times, not get one single write-up. They're not going to be close to the edge of their job. On the other hand, a disciplinary action, it only takes 4 times to get removed. So, this is something that's completely different. The stakes of, discipline are so much different, and management likes to equate them together. It is not the same. All right, so moving on, we're going to talk about reprisal for release of information. This is ELM 666.18. This is just one thing I would like to point out to use in your arsenal for protection. Let me read this first, and then I'll tell you how it relates to anything. No one may take or fail to take personal action or threaten to do so. Personnel action, that's like discipline, or threaten to do so with respect to any employee or applicant for employment because the employee or applicant discloses information that he or she believes evidences A, violation of any law, rule, or regulation, or B, a gross waste of funds, gross mismanagement, an abuse of authority, or a substantial and specific danger to public health or safety. Disclosure of information that is specifically prohibited by law does not carry that protection as described above. However, no disclosure under A or B above is prohibited by law if made to the Inspector General of the Postal Service. There could be no reprisal for disclosures to the Inspector General unless the complaint was made for the information disclosed with knowledge that it was false, with willful disregard for its truth or falsity. So, what this is a whistleblower protection. And this, you got to be careful, because like it said, it has to be information that is not specifically prohibited by law to be disclosed. So you got to know your stuff if you're going to fuck around with this provision. But, for example, they're changing my start time at my building. They're going to increase it by an hour. I know that they're doing this because they're not going to hire any clerks. They fucked up their budget by doing it themselves. Management worked clerk work. They had CCAs working it. I filed a grievance. They started working it. They're tired of working it. Now they're going to give the skeleton crew an extra hour to get this stuff ready so that maybe management doesn't have to work it. That's not fair to the carrier. Every time a clerk retires, they don't replace them. That's not our fault. They need to staff accordingly. Coming up, I'm going to start picketing. And I'm going to talk about mismanagement. And I'm going to say that management is making it easier for us to get our heat strokes. They're making it an unsafe environment with the changes that they're making. I can talk about the fact that management is increasing the start time. I'm not going to be able to talk about any logistics that are specifically not public information. So I'm going to be general in the information I disclose. That is exactly what I would say when it comes to a gross waste of funds, gross mismanagement, or abuse of authority. And I'm not disclosing any particular information that is prohibited by law. So you got to be careful with this one. But if I decide to do that, picket out in front of the post office every morning with that extra hour they gave me to picket, then guess what? If they file discipline, use 666.18. And you should be able to get out of that discipline. Of course, there's always that small chance that you got a bad Step B decision or whatever, bad arbitration. In general, it should be protected. And that's the provision, one of them at least, from the ELM that I would be using for that particular matter. Now we're getting into ELM 667. And when we talk about ELM 667, I'd like to point out that ELM 667.17 specifically prohibits the obstruction of mail. And it actually is mimicked. So it comes from 18 U.S. Code 1701, but also it's imitated in M41. I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, don't quote me on this, it's in section 112, if I'm not mistaken, but I could be wrong on that when it comes to M41. I'm not going to look right now. I know I've said it on my podcast before on an undelivered mail thing, but Title 18, U.S. Code 1701 provides penalties for a person who knowingly and willfully obstruct or retard the mail. The statute does not afford employees immunity from arrest or violations of the law. One thing I would use when it comes to this, use it in your undelivered mail grievances. Say that it specifically says there's penalties for persons who knowingly and willfully obstruct the mail or retard the mail. I would point out knowingly is the carrier. The carrier's doing it knowingly and technically willfully because even though they don't want to, they're following the instructions as they're expected. So I'd say that this imposes unreasonable burden on our carriers in terms of violation of law. We could be implicated in a violation of law due to our instructions from our supervisors or postmaster. I'd say that you should use that one and the M41. Look through it, the M41, to make sure it's the right quote, but you'll find it. Use those in your undelivered mail grievances. Let's see. Okay, ELM 667.21. So have you ever had a supervisor record a call, record a conversation, or particularly take maybe a picture of something and use it against you? Or maybe even have somebody on the line to verify, like, for example, maybe two supervisors were there to verify what you were saying was true. Listen to this, 667.21. During the course of activities related to postal employment, postal employees may not record, monitor, or otherwise intercept the oral or wire communications of any other person through the use of any electronic, mechanical, or other device, nor listen in on a telephone conversation, nor direct another to do so, unless all parties involved in the communication are made aware of and consent to such interception. I would use this in times where, you think it was inappropriate that management shared particular communication, especially as it relates to a phone call, especially if they were somehow recorded a phone call. Moving on, we're almost through this. And like I said, these are not all the examples, but we're already long on this. We're almost through this, though. Go to ELM 930, which is one of my favorite ELM sections. Has to do with the uniforms. Anything to do with uniforms, check out ELM 930. But if you got those NEMP grievances where they're not given the uniform on time or whatever, any grievance that involves uniforms and allowances, look at ELM 931.11. Certain employees must wear prescribed uniforms in performing their duties. These employees are entitled to A, a uniform allowance to purchase authorized uniform items, or B, to be furnished uniforms that meet Postal Service specifications. So here we have, first of all, you can use this when they're not giving it to you on time, and then they expect you to be in uniform, but also during uniform discipline. If you can talk to an employee and they made management aware in the interview, or maybe they didn't, and you can talk to them yourself and ask them, did you have the uniform allowance to do this? Or did management make you aware of your expectations after your allowance was already spent? Use that against them. Go to ELM 930 and look through it. There's a lot of gems in that one. When it comes to safety, ELM 8, more specifically, listen to this one. ELM 811.24. The safety philosophy of the Postal Service is the following. Any occupational injury and illness can be prevented. This goal is realistic, not theoretical. Supervisors and managers have primary responsibility for the well-being of employees and must fully accept this principle. You know, it's got a lot of good things in this section, but that right there, you can use that in plenty of safety grievances. You can use that in OWCP violations, potentially. It says, there's so many different things you can use in this ELM. And like I said, relates to working conditions. So it's technically should be included. And I got one final thing to go over. We're going to talk about training. ELM 7 covers training and development. ELM 7, listen to this, ELM 711.11, the people employed by the Postal Service are its major asset, and the training and development of these human resources is a key investment strategy for individual and organizational success. The Postal Service provides systems and resources to meet the training and development needs of its employees, to fulfill organizational skill requirements, and to provide individuals with career growth opportunities. Broadly stated, it is the Postal Service policy to provide employees with training and development opportunities consistent with operational requirements, occupational categories, and skill requirements. So again, safety grievances, were they trained? If not, use ELM 7. Find a few things that would conflict with what they did. If you're trying to ask for training for a remedy, maybe you have a mutual respect, use ELM 7 to justify its reasonableness. Like, for example, the Postal Service has a vested interest in training based on what I just read to you. So if you think that training is appropriate for a remedy, use that to help back up the appropriateness of the remedy you're requesting. There's many different ways you can use the ELM in the many different provisions. For example, one of the ways you can justify the ELM's incorporation into Article 19, if the management's trying to argue that that's not a handbook that's related to Article 19 incorporation, you can point out the fact that in ELM 5, we have many of our procedures for leave that is completely related to our working conditions. A lot of those procedures and expectations and policies are not even in our JCAM. A lot of the JCAM says refer to ELM 5 blah blah blah. Refer to ELM 5 blah blah blah. Because ELM 5 is our leave section, including LWAP. So that alone should help justify the fact that this is a handbook that's highly related to wages, hours, and working conditions. Because even the JCAM and the National Agreement lean on using the ELM for the leave provisions. But there's many different things in the ELM, and each and every handbook we should be reading and using to our best advantage. Like I said before, the biggest utilization I've had with this is defense and discipline. Because if you're starting to charge management with all these issues, then once they charge our carriers, they're going to have to be equitable. And you know they're not going to be. But just like anything, you got to take these things with a grain of salt, because if you can't get them locally, you're not likely to get them at Steppy or higher. So start with the things that your local management will allow to come right through. Because if you can start settling at Formal A or Informal A that, you know, management violated ELM 665, blah, 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 and you have a few of them, it's going to be a lot easier to get at Steppy or even at arbitration. I think lately arbitration's been giving us better decisions. I got a fucking remand recently that is just hideous. So they didn't let me have the information I needed for a letter of demand. I asked for how they calculated it. I sent that out December 6th. They took 4 fucking months. Mind you, it's normally, I got other decisions back in 3 months. 4 months just to give me a remand. So management got an additional 4 months to find this information. And they remanded it saying, hey, meet on this again. Holy shit. What are we doing? Why are we giving management this latitude? They had their opportunity. They didn't supply it. It's over with now. Why are you reopening that box? It's not fair to the city letter carrier. Would you do that for me? Absolutely not. If this was a contract case and I needed to provide something, you would just fuck me over and say you didn't prove your burden. What the hell is going on here? Why is management afforded a double standard that doesn't apply to me? That's beside the point. I shouldn't be talking about that. I'm going to be going over route count strategy for line 21 specifically. Maybe tomorrow, maybe Friday. But don't forget, I got the NALC Director of City Delivery candidate, Rob Kosier. He is a CLC candidate. He's coming on Saturday, as long as he doesn't cancel. I got my first cancellation last week. I apologize for those that were looking forward to having Lloyd on. But, you know, there's only so much you can do. I was going to be super sick anyway, so it would have been a funny one. But, yeah, Rob Kosier, Saturday, send me questions. That's going to be at rosevillewreckingball@yahoo.com. Please. Hopefully you learned something valuable today. And as always, have a good day.
If these guys are getting educated, we will be in big trouble.
Management's been weighing you down like a bag of wet catalogs, but you don't gotta take it. You strap on the elbow of education, dig it?
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Roseville Wrecking Ball. The Roseville Wrecking Ball.
The Roseville Wrecking Ball is an Article 8 scholar, and thank God, we need Article 8 scholars right now. The Grievous Genius and the Roseville Wrecking Ball doing amazing work.
Tune into the Parcels of Knowledge podcast while you're on the route. That's the mailman's playbook, brother.